Hi, welcome to the Echo Podcast, where we discuss how our hearts and minds can be a reflection of God's heart and mind and what that even means in this world. We're Pastor Dan Sinkhorn and Adrienne Tarullo from Shiloh Church of Jasper, Indiana, and we've gone pulpit to podcast. We hope you enjoy today's episode where we do a little exploration of the Christmas season and Advent and even the second coming of Christ. So buckle up. And I hope you enjoy today's episode. Pastor Dan, before we went live on the air today, we were talking a little bit about some of the writings that you've been doing about the birth of Jesus and Christmas and like what all that means to you, and some things that you said you had kind of pulled from your subconscious, I guess. Mm-hmm. Like some thoughts that you didn't realize you were thinking, but when you just started typing, they flowed. So I thought that would be a fun place to start today, if you wouldn't mind sharing some of those things that you came across or thoughts of the birth of Jesus.
Okay. Well, Adrienne, I started with something that changed in my thinking decades ago. I can't really remember exactly when, but I believe it was in the 21st century. I think it was sometime between 2000 and 2009, let's say. Somewhere in there, something shifted in my thinking, and knowledge that I had obtained changed the way I interpreted a lot of things. And that's actually good. I mean, let's hope that this podcast does that for somebody. As you know, I'm a big advocate for critical thinking. And so for me, critical thinking is fun. Like some people think going to the gym is fun. You know, it's exercise for the brain, and I enjoy it. I love a good critical thinking exercise. And so somewhere in my life, in that period I mentioned, there was a chance for me to consider the possibility that everything that I read in my Bible is literally true, and that everything it refers to literally happened or will happen. And the only reason that most of us find it difficult to accept is because we're trying to frame it within our worldview that doesn't have a place for cosmic matters. That is it's a word that we Christians use to describe the supernatural realm of heaven and the invisible or unseen realm that is all around us. That Bible references it all the time, but modern people dismiss the Bible as being mythological, and they tend to think that whatever they're reading in the Bible that they can't make sense of is probably due to the fact that they're smarter than the people who wrote the Bible and the people who lived in those times, and therefore those people just weren't very smart and they didn't know how to describe things or whatever. And I would argue that you could take any person from history who is essentially physically, mentally healthy as any of us. You could take any one of those people and you could give them the same 20 or 30 years of knowledge and life experiences as us, and you wouldn't be able to differentiate them from a person of the first century versus a person of the 21st century. You know, everybody's the same. The only thing that's different is technology, really. And so our technology and our culture define us and the way we interpret things more than our intelligence or whatever. So I got this idea that first thing you have to do is read the Bible as though the people that are in it are just as smart as you are. They're just interpreting their world through their technology, and their technology is a huge part of what shapes their culture. And so they might call something that they can't technologically interpret as spiritual or supernatural, but that doesn't mean that it is or isn't. And so when you read the Bible, you go, okay, some of these miracles you can explain because we could perform such miracles now and know how and why we did it. We could revive someone who dropped dead if we did CPR on them. And so someone could say we raised the dead when in fact we performed a life-saving treatment that we know they didn't know. So there's that. But then what about the stuff that can't be explained even by modern people? What do you do with that? Do you dismiss it because if you can't explain it, then it's probably not real? Well, that seems like you're selling the Bible short. And it also means that you're also selling history short. You're making history stupid. You know, you're saying, well, it couldn't have happened because I can't make sense of it. Well, that's a little ridiculous. So this is where my whole thinking process was going. This is where my mind went on this. And so I started reading certain passages in the Bible, like, for example, the passage from Genesis 6 that talks about the Nephilim and the men of renown and the ones who were angel beings that interacted with human women and created these Nephilim and angelic sort of hybrid people and giants and all this kind of stuff. And then I started thinking about how the Bible's pretty explicit that the reason that God destroyed the earth with the flood in those days was because it was so corrupt. And I mean that by, genetically speaking, that there were just too many weird things going on. And Noah, it says explicitly in the Bible that Noah was chosen with his family to survive because their lineage was pure all the way back to Adam, meaning that their bloodline didn't contain any of this weird DNA that had come as a result of all of that. So I started thinking, okay, how does that happen? How does that happen? Well, wait, the Bible says that when this great rebellion happened in heaven and a third of the angels went under the leadership of the one we call Satan now, or Lucifer, or the angel of light, this basically this principal character that is the enemy of God brings along with him a third of the heavenly host, and we don't know how many that is. Could be a lot. Seems like it was. And God casts them out of heaven to the earth. And so it turns out maybe that the earth is populated by these beings that have been cast out of heaven. And heaven we think of as a place that's sort of beyond space and time. And so in a sense, these beings that are cast out of heaven have been cast into this sort of terrarium we call Earth. That is an envelope of space-time. And that suddenly makes me think, okay, wait. Then that means that maybe the Greek mythology we read when I was in 8th grade that talked about hybrid, half human, half animal beings and gods and children of gods and all this kind of stuff, and Zeus and Hades and all this. And it's like, wait a minute, what if that really happened? Mm-hmm. What if all of that was real? And what if we tend to think of the earth as being as old as the story of Eden? But if it turns out that science isn't wrong when it says that the earth is millions of years old, just Eden is only 6,000 or 7,000 years old. Why not? Yeah. Then all of a sudden, all the stuff I learned when I was a little kid who loved dinosaurs, like most of the little boys that I know, okay, they can be 60 million years old. That's okay. Greek mythology and Mesopotamian mythology and all of these other mythologies that have all these bizarre hybrid creatures and these strange humans that are like people like Nimrod, who is this mighty man of renown who's probably was a giant, and maybe that's why he could build this enormous thing. And they look at ancient structures that still exist today and they go, how could these people do that? Well, a lot of things would be easier if you had giants. You could build a pyramid that big if you had a handful of giants on hand. They'd pick up a rock like it's a big, a stone the size of a school bus and stack it on another one. They could do that because they're giants. And so it's like, all of a sudden I'm thinking, the Bible's not that hard to believe if you just stop trying to think like you are the end all be all or the brain that is beyond all brains, because that's what people do.
Yeah, it's like putting God in a box
that
you're defining. Well, because I can't understand this, then God, you can't possibly do that.
Right.
That's not cool.
Well, you know, one of my favorite books when I was a teenager was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. And one of my favorite lines in there, I can't even get it right because I don't remember the exact words, but basically a bunch of brilliant scholars argue that God doesn't exist, and they present God with their argument, and God says, "Oh, that makes sense," and so God ceased to exist. So they basically approach this as though they can convince God that he doesn't exist.
Okay.
And that God would say, you know, now that you mention it, I guess, but I hadn't thought of it that way. I guess I don't exist, you know.
Poof, gone.
And he's gone, right? So that's just really funny. And it points out the absurdity of the human pride, you know. And the human pride is a direct correlation or reflection to the pride of the enemy of God, who is somehow convinced that even though he's a created being, he could do God better than God the creator. I mean, that's absurd when you think about it, that somehow you think that you could run what God created better than the creator, you know. Now, in the world, in the world of the flesh that we live in, you could say that, you know, you could say that, you know, I'm the artist, but I have a manager who thinks that they can manage my productivity better than me, and maybe that's true. But we're talking about something way beyond that. We're talking about the difference between God the Father, who existed before anything he created, and one of his created beings assuming that they could take that role over as the pre-existent, everything God, you know. And so the vanity of Satan is off the charts. We don't have a scale that can tell us how really vain God's enemy is, that Satan is. But one of his modes of operation is to convince us that we're smarter than God, and that if we had a chance, we could convince God that he doesn't exist. See, that's Satan. That's how he works. So I felt so enlightened when I started thinking, my goodness, the world could be both millions of years old and the descendants of Adam, and the idea of God being present on earth in a place called Eden, that could coexist. Those stories could coexist. And it actually makes more sense when you put it that way. All of a sudden, the flood of Noah makes sense, because essentially God has allowed the enemies of God to roam the earth and do whatever they want here. And they've created all sorts of weird manifestations of their evil, pride-filled, twisted minds. And you even get the impression from reading the Bible in those terms and thinking about some of the mythologies of the world, in Norse mythology and stuff like this, you get the impression that some of those who are fallen from heaven are more evil than others. And some of them, they're actually kind of doing good things because they sort of want to do the right thing, but they're still, you know, poisoned with sin, right? And so not only does the world pre-exist Eden, but the world is filled with all different levels of evil and authority and government and cities. And you begin to realize that city, nation, states, and whole entire areas of the world are been populated for millions of years by these beings and their descendants. And you realize that there may have even been a sort of form of humanity on the earth that wasn't the same as the ones made in Eden in God's image. And so if you had like the prequel to the Bible, right, which is this period of the Bible that, you know, like episode, you know, like Star Wars started with episode 5, and then they gave us episode 1 and episode 2, whatever. So if you could kind of like go to episode 1 or 2, let's say, of the story, it would be the story of Earth after the fall, right? And what was the Earth like before? And then we get to the Bible, episode 5, right? Now, some people are probably going, okay, he is really acting sacrilegious here. It's okay. Nobody will die.
It's just a fun exploration.
It's just a mental exercise. Exercise is good. Who wants a flabby brain?
Or a flabby stomach.
I know. And you're probably more likely to have a flabby stomach because it works. You have to work a lot harder to keep that from happening.
Especially this time of year.
Ugh. Well, anyway. Suppose God says, okay, I have decided it's time for me to take the earth and make it an extension of heaven. And so God sort of opens up a space-time portal. Now, just bear with me on this. He basically cuts a hole in the side of the terrarium and he connects it. You ever seen those acrylic aquariums where they have a tube connecting one aquarium to another?
Yeah.
It's like God's connecting heaven to earth similarly. And paradise is this place on earth that is directly tied to heaven. And that's why God can move about in the Garden of Eden, so to speak, in this realm that is an extension of heaven on earth that we call Eden. And so naturally, Adam walks in the cool of the evening with God. Why not? You know, because God's front porch is right over there, you know. And God creates these people in God's own image from the dirt that has basically become part of heaven. So we're made from the dust of heaven, you know. And Adam's race is unique. They're made in the image of God. They're not made from the hybrid weirdness that was going on outside the garden in this place occupied by all manner of strange creatures that are descended from the fall from heaven, right? And so, you know, this whole story starts to make all kinds of sense when you put it in those terms. It's like, okay, so this was all the revelation of 10 or 15, 20 years ago, whenever it was, right? And I'm getting to Christmas because this is all tied together if you think about it. So in this story, the one thing that is weird and sort of unaccounted for is that apparently Satan, or God's enemy, has, you know, kind of caught wind that there's this place on earth that God has extended heaven to, and this being, Satan, can come and go. He can enter heaven and leave heaven whenever he wants. So no wonder he goes and accuses God and, you know, tells him, yeah, well, let's talk about your buddy Job, you know, and no wonder he can come into the garden and tell them, hey, you know, God's messing with you here. He's not really telling you the truth. And so the whole garden story turns into a picture that is both literal and metaphorical. You know, like, see, I don't literally believe that there was a guy named Adam and a gal named Eve. You know, I think that's probably a helpful metaphor when ancient people are trying to explain a really complex idea to us. But there was a sense that there was the first man, which the Bible language would call the Adam, or the Adam, right? Which means the human made in God's image. And that's why I like to say descendants of Adam, because I'm trying to differentiate between the ones that are descended from what God created in Eden versus those other creatures outside the fence. Because those creatures he eventually has to wipe out because they're so messed up. And he wants to preserve them through Noah, the bloodline of Adam, the first creature made in God's image. And at some point in the story, there's a man and a woman that are the two people that God has created to begin this race of the children of Adam. And she messes up. And by the way, as long as we're on the topic, Adam sees that his bride has broken the covenant, believed the lie, and cast herself out of God's favor and out of God's presence, no longer able to live in that little piece of heaven. And he chooses to eat too, for her. Keep that in mind. So the story goes on. God eventually floods the planet and wipes out most of this crazy stuff. But somehow there are still elements of this wacky design that was created in the world before the flood. And so the earth really is, there's two stories of planet Earth. There's Earth before the Great Flood and Earth after the Great Flood. And the Earth before the Great Flood was something primal and prehistoric and everything I read about in my dinosaur books and more, you know. and all these different remnants that they find of human-like creatures. It's all legit as far as I'm concerned. The only problem is that radically intelligent human beings who are radically proud keep trying to figure out how to fit it all together without believing the Bible.
Yeah.
So they're basically working up a way to tell the story without putting faith in Scripture. Mm-hmm. And that's their pride.
I actually watched a video of a scientist who was defending Christianity in the creation story, and he said we have more evidence that the creation story and the flood happened than we do that it didn't happen.
Yeah.
He was like, we found exoskeletons of like marine creatures at the top of mountains.
Yeah.
How else does that happen without a flood? So I found that intriguing and fascinating.
Well, I have, I've never been to the rim of the Grand Canyon, although I've been close. I've never been there. And I imagine sometimes when I look at the pictures, which never do a thing like that justice because it's just too big for pictures and too three-dimensional for pictures. But the first thought I ask myself is they really believe that a river started on top of all of that and just gradually wore it all down? And the river's still just the Colorado River, which is a pretty impressive river, but it's not as wide as the Ohio River. It's not as wide as the Mississippi.
Yeah.
And the Mississippi doesn't have a Grand Canyon.
Right.
Come on now. What would cause something like that? A huge deluge, right?
Yeah.
What caused all the horror in North Carolina after the heavy rains and everything? It was floods, man, major floods.
Yeah.
Deluges of walls of water just tearing through and ripping everything out of their way. Now that would create something like a Grand Canyon, and only a flood on the scale of the Great Flood that entirely engulfed the planet could do it. You don't have to be a smart to look at it and say, that actually makes more sense than the prevailing theory. Yeah. The problem is, in order for that to make sense, you have to believe something that we are just so sure that we can't believe without somehow losing our pride or swallowing our pride. And there's the problem. Mm-hmm. So I need to pick up the pace because I'm basically trying to do the history of the world, and we don't have that much time. But when we get to the Christmas story, think about these things, all right? So Advent then is a season when we anticipate the second coming of Christ, but we also do that in light of the first coming. And the reason we're so confident that the second coming will happen is because the first coming was predicted, and it happened exactly as predicted. Every prediction related to the first coming of Christ was fulfilled. In fact, he went out of his way to make sure that all of the various prophecies about him were fulfilled so there could be no doubt in people's minds. And yeah, I know people who just refuse to believe, who would pick holes through all of that. And there are arguments for all of their picking, but what's the point in fighting with them if they don't want to believe? I don't waste my time trying to convince people who are trying to convince me that I'm wrong. See, you can't talk me out of believing I exist. And you can't really talk God out of believing he exists. And so nobody's going to try to convince me that I'm wrong if they are doing so with the intention of destroying or defeating me, because that's what Satan does. And I can smell him when he's coming, and you can too. Do-si-do. So we have this story of a fallen bride whose lover sacrifices himself to be with her. In other words, Jesus, who's referred to in the New Testament as the second Adam, sees his bride having given into the lie, having been convicted of sin, and he says, I want to be with them. And so he eats the apple. He takes upon himself our sin in order to redeem us.
Wow. I had never put that connection together.
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense.
Right? So this story is so majestic. It's so majestic. It's so beautiful. And so basically, the coming of the Messiah, it means a lot of things to a lot of people, even in the Bible. But throughout the story, things are happening in a way that ultimately we can see with hindsight, that obviously was hard for them to see in the moment, that tell us that this is all going exactly according to Christ, to the Lord's plan. And so Jesus inhabits this woman by power of the Holy Spirit, this young woman who's probably a girl, probably a young teenager. And it's her faith and her willingness and her husband's faith and willingness, or her betrothed's faith and willingness. And betrothal in the Bible, and particularly in Jewish culture, was essentially the same as being married. They just hadn't come together yet. They hadn't been living in the same home and consummating the marriage. And, consummation makes it a done deal. So they hadn't consummated their marriage yet, but for all intents and purposes, they were married. And this is significant because she's a virgin giving birth. This is a conceiving of a child without the normal actions required for that. And so this is a miraculous conception. And of course, there's other mythologies that have similar stories, but there are other things in the story that validate it in ways that are profound. I was talking with some older folks across the way Tuesday, and I was telling them, I want you to think about this for a second. Mary's like, okay, God, I'll have your baby. I'll do this. And Joseph's like, okay, God, I'll take care of her, and I'll raise that kid like he's my own. Great. Then all of a sudden this decree comes out, and it's like at the sword point, they're being told you have to go to the place of your ancestors to be registered. If you refuse, then you're defying the conquering nation of Rome, and you're going to die, and we're going to take everything you own, and that'll be that. And so they got to go. And so they're on this donkey working their way down from Nazareth to Capernaum, and then along the Jordan River, and then up through the Valley of the Doves, and working their way over to Jericho. And then they're going to go from basically 1,300 feet below sea level to 3,500 and some feet above sea level, and they're going to do this all in about 3 days, and they're going to go to a town where they may or may not be able to find lodging. And then all this is happening while she's in her 9th month, and she's already pretty sure she could have that baby any minute. And surely along the way, she must have been thinking, Lord, I said I'd get on, I said I'd do your plan, but seriously, I couldn't be at my house with my mother and my midwives, and now I'm maybe going to have this baby somewhere along this twisted road and out in the wilderness. I mean, really, Lord? And then they get to Bethlehem, and Joseph's looking for a place for them to stay and hoping he can find a midwife, and they can't find a place to stay, and there's certainly not going to be any midwives or anybody there to help deliver this baby. And so they end up in a cave, basically, that's used to hold ewes that are about to give birth to their lambs. And so they're basically in the shepherd's cave, and they're in the shelter that is designed for birthing lambs. And he's there, acting as midwife. And this is something Joseph doesn't have any experience with. It's not something he knows that much about. He's probably watched animals give birth and stuff, but this is not the same thing. And Mary's like, I'm just a kid, I'm just a teenager. I've never done this before. And when a woman's in the midst of her birth pangs, there's a time when she's thinking, I don't have any energy left. There's nothing more to give. I can't, this baby's going to end up halfway in and halfway out or something. I can't do this, and Joseph's got to figure out how to help her get through all of that. And this whole story, those two had to be going, I thought I was pretty faithful, but this is really testing my faith. And then when it's all over, the angels appear to the shepherds in those same fields. And talk about cosmic. they appear to these angels appear to the shepherds. And why those shepherds? Why? Well, those fields are on hillsides just below the sort of peak of the hill that Bethlehem is on as a city. And Bethlehem's not a big city. It's just a little village. And from those hillsides, they can look 5 or 6 miles across the way, and they can see the torches burning around the temple in Jerusalem, right? Because it turns out that those shepherds and those sheep are managed and owned and operated by a parent company called the temple priests. You know, they work for the temple. They raise the sheep that are going to be driven over to the temple to be used for sacrificial offerings to atone for people's sins. And it turns out their cave is where the Savior of the world is being born, in the same cave where the temple sheep are being born. Okay?
Wow.
And it turns out the star that leads people directly to the Lord, probably not a star. They just wouldn't know how to explain it. And I defy anybody today to be able to explain it some other way. Maybe they would call it orbs, you know, because we see orbs sometimes. But here's what I think the Star of Bethlehem was. It wasn't a star. It wasn't a comet. It wasn't something that was outside our atmosphere. And the wise people didn't follow it like it's something in the general direction they were supposed to go. They knew that where this thing was, they would find the Lord, and they were absolutely right. And I believe it's because the Star of Bethlehem was not a star or some kind of celestial thing. It was a hole in the fabric of space-time. It was a portal that was right where the baby Jesus is, because all of hell wants this baby not to happen. And all of heaven is right on the other side of this portal, ready to defend that baby. Not against people, but against enemies of darkness and vile, evil creatures of the night, the evil that was descended from those who fell from God's favor and got cast out of heaven. Like this is the difference between the fabric of space-time and the presence of all the heavenly hosts on the other side. And our sign, I actually believe this is what happened. I believe that portal looked like a star because everything in the Bible that describes interactions between heaven and earth always describe bright light that is so intense it can't be comprehended. It's so bright. And in the story of John on Patmos, when he's writing about the Revelation, he says, you know, I'm just minding my own business on my rock here, and suddenly this opening happens in space and time, and it's so bright that I can see the Lord standing there, but I can't make out who he is because he's backlit by this intense light. I mean, think about that. You've been inside a dark house and somebody comes in from the outside and they're standing in the doorway and you can't see them because the light behind them is blinding you, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, you know, so this fabric of space-time that we consider reality is actually very malleable. And it turns out that if God wants to, he can open a hole in space-time and say, and over here on the other side is heaven. And literally, I'm picturing something that could appear between you and me right now. We're about 6 feet apart, and I could be looking at this hole in space-time and can't see you behind it, and you'd be looking at it too and not be able to see me behind it, because that's what I mean. And so that is what I think the Star of Bethlehem was. And I think that that evening when that baby was born, that star opens up like curtains on a stage. And all of a sudden, all of heaven is being revealed before these shepherds. And the view they had 5 seconds earlier is distorted by this opening in the fabric of space and time. And they're seeing angels from horizon to horizon. They're seeing heaven. And all of those are there as a sign that heaven is watching this birth with incredible intensity, because so is hell. Because everything rides on this single cosmic event. Because everything rides on this child growing up and doing the thing that only the Son of God can do. And that's redeem creation after it has been corrupted and violated for thousands and millions of years by evil. That's what I think happened on Christmas Eve. And we sing about the little town of Bethlehem that still it lies in the still quiet of the night. And they don't know that every creature that lives in heaven is standing right up against that threshold of space and time, ready to pour through to do battle with every creature in hell that would consider interfering with the birth of this child. And Mary and Joseph are going, how do we end up here? What on earth is going on? And God's answer to them, and they are some of the most precious, beloved people of God. Like I'm not saying God loves them more than he loves you and me, but he had to have a really high opinion of them. You know, what with the task he had charged them with, right? Yeah. And he had to have a really high opinion of Mary and Joseph, and he still would have said to Mary and Joseph, guys, this isn't about you. This is not about you. Thank you for being willing participants in my plan, and I want you to know that there are many and countless of incredible rewards waiting for you. Because this is about you in the end. I'm going to redeem you so that my son can have you for his eternal companions forever. But in the meantime, you are participating in something that's bigger than you. Because all of hell's just right over here and all of heaven's just right over here. And your child is my son who's standing in the breach. You know? Wow. That's a cosmic Christmas story.
I'm speechless. That is so much cooler than Santa. So much cooler. I love that.
Yeah, and let's not diss Santa. I know that's not your intention, because as I often tell children, even when I'm playing Santa, which happens from time to time, he does this because that story has affected him too. And in his own way, he's part of this cosmic act of mercy and grace. And it's symbolic. You know, he's being symbolically the Heavenly Father bringing God's grace to all these children to say, you're worthy. And for love's sake, I'm going to save you. I'm going to do this for you. You know, I watched this movie the other night with my family that was recommended to me called Red One. And it's just the latest version of the Santa story. And, you know, it's got J.K. Simmons in it, and it's got Dwayne Johnson. And there's parts of it that are pretty corny and campy, but there's a theme in it from the very beginning that I really like, and that is that Santa, you know, he knows who's on the naughty list, but he's already planning on showing him a lot of grace. He's already planning on cutting him some slack, because what he sees on the naughty list are people who just forgot how to be children. You know? Yeah. And he just needs the people that work with him on this annual endeavor to never forget that this is about the children, even the ones who grow up. You know, and it's a cool message, you know. Yeah. But there's this interesting thing in the story that I like, because it's an interesting twist. Y'all can take this for whatever it's worth, but if you watch Red One, Santa has a counterpart named Krampus. Now, Krampus is a character from Norse literature, I think, or Scandinavian literature. I'm not exactly sure, but from up in those northern countries of Europe and above Europe. And Krampus is the one who comes to the kids who are on the naughty list. And he's a scary version of Santa. Like, he's not wearing a red suit, you know, and he's definitely a frightening character. And in this movie, Red One, they really juxtapose Santa and his alter ego, Krampus, you know, and it's a really clever design in the story, because Krampus, it turns out, isn't as bad as he seems. And if the truth be told, he doesn't like punishing kids who are on the naughty list. But it's really interesting because, you know, if you want to talk to kids about Santa and you want to somehow be able to weave them a version of the Santa story that will help them see the story of God's creation and God's goodness and the evil of God's enemy and how God redeems the world through grace and love, well, you can definitely use the Santa story to help that. And the truth is, we've been using literature and storytelling for as long as humanity's existed to teach people these important lessons. Our Bible is an oral history that eventually got written down. There's some fascinating stories or research, I guess you would say, about how before let me rephrase this. Those stars in the heaven, the constellations that have the various Greek and Roman names, that may very well predate Christianity, but in the early day or biblical, I just need to start over. The constellations in the heavens have Roman and Greek names, and those names and those stories around those constellations probably predate Judeo-Christianity and what we would call the world of the Bible. But there's evidence that in the early history of the Bible era and the people of Genesis, let's say, they took all of those characters and retold the stories about the biblical narrative. So Virgo can also be the virgin who gives birth. Like the whole story of the Bible is written in the stars. It's just that it was already it's already was corrupted by the fallen angels, but the actual story of the Bible and everything that God would do, it's written in the stars, in the constellations. And so when the people who told the Bible stories before they were written down told the stories, they'd do it in the middle of a place where we didn't have all this light pollution called the city, right? They'd be out there in the countryside where the stars were as brilliant as anything you can imagine. And they could see the Milky Way, they could see it all, and they'd lay under those stars and look up, and someone would say, now you see that? This is what God did back with Adam, and this is when the flood came, and tell the story. So using storytelling to teach people the truth about God and God's redemption and love and grace, that's just as old as humanity. So go for it. Santa's an awesome guy. He's not the Savior, but he represents God's loving grace. He represents a gift giver because God gave a gift, his own son. And people who love his son give gifts.
Yeah. You said that version of Santa in the sermon, I think it was last week maybe, and I had never heard anything like that before. And I just thought that was so beautiful that Santa does what he does because he loves God. Yeah. And he loves Christ, and he's just being Christ's servant by giving gifts just like Christ gave the ultimate gift for us. We were talking about that at our young adult small group last night, and your daughter Bethany, who's one of my closest friends, she was like, oh, I love Santa because my dad has taught me the story of Santa in that context from when I was teeny tiny, like barely, bopping around. And she was like, I still love Santa to this day. Because of that. I'm like, wow, that is just so cool.
Yeah, what if it turns out Santa's just a really awesome Christian?
Yeah.
The kind we all wish we could be, dedicating ourselves to love, how cool is that?
That's so cool.
And of course, Satan, God's enemy, will take every chance that is possible to distort the story in order to mislead us. And so one of the things I've talked about in the last couple of weeks in church is the last days being marked by deception. And so I keep telling people the last few weeks, this is about anticipating Christ's second coming. And there are certain signs that we can expect to see. And they'll be as wondrous and terrifying and supernatural as anything that's ever happened. We have to be prepared for that possibility. We have to be willing to accept that even in our world of computer-generated graphics And in our world of Photoshop and in our world of being able to send 1,000 drones up and make an image in the sky, and like we have the capacity to create facsimiles of these supernatural heavenly events, but they're really going to happen, and there won't be any mistaking them for what they are. And these are signs that we can expect that we are living in the last days. But one of the most underrated and significant signs that we're in the last days is the multiplication of deception. People are deceived. They're take everything that would point to Jesus, everything that would point to salvation through Christ is being deliberately distorted, as though it's a little bit like the Grinch that stole Christmas, right? It's deliberately intended to undo the message that is the truth of God's love and salvation for the world. And it's a little like the distortion could be as simply described as people going along and taking all the road signs and turning them in the wrong direction. It'd be like someone taking all the street signs in your town down one night and replacing them with street signs from other parts of town, and just deliberately trying to confuse you and mislead you. And it'd be like somebody taking the traffic signals and messing with the wiring so that it's green going both directions or something like that. That's what I mean by the deception of the last days. There are so many messages out there that are meant to distort the truth and keep you from seeing the truth clearly. And in that way, everybody can relate to those end time events, because some of it's hard for us to relate to if we're living in a quiet little town like Jasper, Indiana, and we're hearing about war in the Middle East, and we're hearing about the fall of the Assad regime, and we're hearing about all this kind of stuff in Ukraine and Europe, and trying to understand how those are indications of world events that the Bible speaks of as signs of the end days. That can be a little overwhelming for us, and it's easy to say, yeah, but it's not happening here. But what is happening here, what's happening in your own house, what's happening in your community, is Satan's lies and the distortions of the truth, the deception. What he wants is for you to not recognize Christ's voice when he calls and says, I'm here, it's the day. What he wants is for you to not tell people the truth about who he is. He doesn't want you to take Santa's story and turn it into a way of revealing the truth of God's love. He doesn't want you to do that. So watch TV, look at the advertising in the marketplace, and what do you see? You see deception everywhere.
Yeah, that's undeniable. Wow. Any last closing thoughts?
I don't know. We've covered a lot.
Yeah.
I just hope that people will find a place to go to church and hear the story of Christmas and maybe listen for the cosmic things that you missed before. I hope that people who are listening to this will have had their eyes opened in a big way. And, some of you will listen to it and you go, man, you are a kook. You are absolutely a kook. I mean, I've been reading my Bible all my life and I never heard such nonsense. Well, okay. One of us is deceived. I don't know for sure whether you're deceived or I'm deceived, but I believe the truth in the Bible more now than I've ever believed it in my life. What about you? Is it easier to disbelieve the parts you don't understand? Or is it more fun to take what you didn't understand, apply some new understanding, and believe with greater fervor than you've ever believed in your life? I don't know. I'm having fun.
Yeah.
Wish you were here.
I'm having fun too. I think I need to hit pause on this treadmill though, because I'm exhausted.
Well, I said do-si-do earlier, and if there's anybody still listening, I'll explain that, because right before we got started, Adrienne and I were talking about who was going to say what, or what questions were going to originate with me and what were going to originate with her. And I said, well, it kind of feels like square dancing, where you grab your partner by the arm and you hook into each other's arms and swing each other around. it gets to the point where you're not sure who's swinging who, but it sure is fun.
Yeah.
And so Adrienne and I like to sit here in front of our microphones and do-si-do for you guys.
I hope you found it challenging and exciting, and I hope your perspective has changed this Christmas for the best way.
Merry Christmas.
Bye.